February 14, 1970, Daytona Beach, Florida. The mechanic from Detroit stood in the pits watching Junior Johnson's number 98 car take the banking at turn 3, and he knew they were looking at something special. Not the driver. Everyone knew Junior could wheel anything with 4 tires and an engine. It was the car itself. Brand new Chevrolet Monte Carlo, first year of production, and it was eating up the track like it had been born there. The temperature was pushing 95 degrees in the shade, but nobody noticed. They were watching the future of American performance unfold at 180 miles per hour. The story really started 6 months earlier in a General Motors boardroom in Detroit. The executives from Chevrolet were sweating, and not from the August heat. Ford had the Thunderbird, Pontiac had the Grand Prix, Buick had the Riviera. Every division had a personal luxury coupe except Chevrolet, and the sales numbers showed it. The accountant from Michigan laid out the figures. They were losing 3,000 sales a month to buyers who wanted something more than a Chevelle, but didn't need a Corvette. The designer from California had been waiting for this moment. He pushed a clay model across the table. Long hood, short deck, flowing lines that looked fast standing still. The longest hood ever put on a Chevrolet, 116 inches of it stretching from the windshield to a chrome bumper that could have come off a locomotive. The production manager from Ohio looked at the design and saw dollar signs, the bad kind. Building a completely new car from scratch would cost millions. But the kid from engineering school, barely 28 years old, had an idea. Use the Chevelle platform. Same frame, same basic mechanicals, but stretched and restyled. They could build it on the same assembly line, use the same suppliers, keep costs down. The Monte Carlo would share bones with its working-class brother, but wear a tuxedo instead of overalls. By September, they had prototypes running. The test driver from Arizona took one through Death Valley when the temperature hit 115 degrees. The cooling system never missed a beat. The mechanic from Kentucky drove one through the mountains of West Virginia in January, 20 degrees below zero, snow coming down so hard he couldn't see 50 feet ahead. Started every time, heated up in minutes, never slipped even on ice. The cars were bulletproof. But reliability didn't sell cars in 1970. Style did. And the Monte Carlo had style like Frank Sinatra had confidence. That hood went on forever, making the driver feel like a pilot more than a commuter. The roofline swept back in what they called a flying buttress design, with rear windows that wrapped around like a fighter jet's canopy. Opera windows, small, formal, completely useless for visibility, but perfect for looking expensive. Chrome everywhere, but not too much. Just enough to catch the light and remind everyone this wasn't some grocery getter. Inside was where the Monte Carlo really separated itself from the muscle car crowd. The designer from New York had spent 3 years studying what people actually wanted in a car, not what magazines said they should want. Bench seat or buckets, both available. Wood grain that looked real enough to fool a carpenter. Instruments clustered in front of the driver like a cockpit, not spread across the dash like a Buick. The radio, AM/FM, 8-track optional, sat right where your hand naturally fell. Air conditioning vents that actually pointed at human beings instead of the windshield. Simple things, but nobody else was doing them. The engine options told you everything about Chevrolet's strategy. Base motor was a 350 cubic inch small block, good for 250 horsepower, enough to move with traffic, not enough to get you killed. But if you knew what boxes to check on the order form, things got interesting. The 350 could come with a 4-barrel carburetor and dual exhaust, bumping power to 300. Still wanted more? The 400 cubic inch engine delivered 330 horses. But the real monster lurked at the bottom of the options list, the 454 SS. That 454 was a beast that belonged in a drag racer, not a luxury coupe. 454 cubic inches of American iron, putting out 360 horsepower and 500 foot-pounds of torque. In a car that weighed 3,800 pounds, it was like strapping a rocket to a recliner. 0 to 60 in 6.9 seconds when a Porsche 911 took 8. Quarter mile in 14.8 seconds at 98 miles per hour. Numbers that made insurance agents reach for their heart pills. The assembly line in Arlington, Texas, started rolling Monte Carlos out in September 1969. The foreman from Louisiana watched the first one come off the line, Cortez Silver with a black vinyl top, black interior, 350 engine, automatic transmission. Build quality was better than anything Chevrolet had done before. Panel gaps you could barely slide a business card through. Paint that looked 6 inches deep. Chrome that didn't pit after the first rainstorm. The workers knew they were building something special. Word spread through the plant that this wasn't just another Chevy. This was the one that would fight the Thunderbird. But the real test came at the dealerships. The salesman from Boston remembered the first one arriving on the truck. Autumn gold with a saddle interior, loaded with every option including the 8-track player and power windows. He parked it in the showroom Friday night. By Saturday noon, he'd written 3 orders and had a waiting list started. People who'd never looked twice at a Chevrolet were writing checks. Doctors, lawyers, small business owners, folks who could afford a Cadillac but wanted something with personality. The marketing department didn't know what to do with the Monte Carlo at first. It wasn't a muscle car, wasn't a family car, wasn't quite a luxury car. The ad man from Madison Avenue finally cracked it. Sell the feeling, not the features. The commercials showed a man driving alone on a winding road, jazz playing softly, city lights in the distance. No racing, no families, no practical talk about trunk space. Just a successful man and his reward for making it. Monte Carlo, when you've earned something better. Simple. Perfect. Junior Johnson figured out what the marketing department couldn't. The Monte Carlo was a wolf in sheep's clothing. That long wheelbase and wide track made it stable at speed. The weight distribution, with that massive hood and engine up front, gave it grip coming out of corners. The formal roofline was actually more aerodynamic than the fastback Chevelle everyone else was running. At Daytona that February day in 1970, he qualified third, led for 60 laps, and finished fourth. Not bad for a luxury car's first race. By March, NASCAR teams were ordering Monte Carlos faster than Chevrolet could build them. The same car that doctors drove to the country club on Sunday was winning races on Monday. Bobby Allison took one to victory lane at Bristol. Cale Yarborough won at Michigan. By season's end, Monte Carlos had won 10 races and convinced everyone that luxury and performance weren't mutually exclusive. Back in the real world, sales were exceeding every projection. The factory had planned for 40,000 units the first year. They sold 145,000. The second shift had to be added at Arlington. The parts suppliers in Indiana and Missouri went to 24-hour production. The railway companies added extra cars just to ship Monte Carlos east. The accountant from Michigan, who'd worried about those lost sales, was now worried about keeping up with demand. The typical Monte Carlo buyer was different from other Chevrolet customers. The data showed they were 35 to 50 years old, household income 40% above average, more likely to live in suburbs than cities or rural areas. But the numbers didn't tell the whole story. These were people who'd worked their way up, who remembered when they couldn't afford a new car at all. The Monte Carlo was proof they'd made it, but not so much proof that their neighbors would resent them. It was success without excess. The mechanic from Pittsburgh bought a used one in 1972, a 70 model with the 350 engine and 43,000 miles on the odometer. Metallic blue with a white vinyl top that was starting to crack at the corners. The seller, a dentist from the suburbs, had babied it. Oil changes every 2,000 miles, garage kept, waxed monthly. Even had the original window sticker in the glove box, 3,823 new, including the AM/FM radio and power steering. The mechanic paid $2,200 cash and drove it home feeling like he'd stolen something. He learned the Monte Carlos quirks over the next few months. The opera windows made backing up an adventure in faith and mirrors. The hood was so long that parking became a geometry exercise. The trunk, despite the car being huge, barely held a set of golf clubs. The back seat was technically sized for 3 adults, but only if those adults didn't mind becoming very familiar with each other. Gas mileage with the 350 was about 12 miles per gallon in town, 16 on the highway if you kept your foot out of it. At 32 cents a gallon, nobody cared. But driving it made all the inconveniences disappear. That long hood floating down the interstate at 75 miles per hour, stable as a bank vault. The engine humming at 2,000 RPM, barely working. The interior quiet enough to have a conversation at normal volume. Power steering so over-coosted you could turn the wheel with one finger. Power brakes that could stop a freight train but were smooth as silk in normal driving. It wasn't fast by muscle car standards, but it was quick enough to merge with confidence and pass with authority. The racing success continued into 1971 and 1972. NASCAR modified the rules to try to slow the Monte Carlos down, but it didn't matter. The combination of aerodynamics, handling, and reliability was unbeatable. Bobby Allison won 10 races in 1972 alone. Cale Yarborough took the Southern 500 at Darlington. Benny Parsons wrapped up the championship. The same car that accountants drove to work was dominating America's fastest sport. Ford tried to respond with the Elite. Dodge brought out the Charger SE. Neither could match the Monte Carlo's combination of style, performance, and price. The insurance companies started paying attention to the Monte Carlo SS models. Kids were buying them and wrapping them around telephone poles at an alarming rate. That 454 engine in inexperienced hands was like giving a toddler a chainsaw. The insurance rates for anyone under 25 became astronomical. $800 a year for insurance on a car that cost $4,000. It killed the SS sales, but Chevrolet didn't care. They were selling plenty of 350s and 400s to the grown-ups. The designer from California, who'd pushed that first clay model across the boardroom table, watched his creation evolve through 1973. The government mandated 5-mile-per-hour bumpers, which meant massive chrome battering rams front and rear. The clean lines got cluttered with federally mandated side markers and reflectors. The engines got choked with emissions equipment, dropping the 454 to 275 horsepower and turning it into a wheeze bag that couldn't outrun a determined mailman. But people kept buying them. 160,000 in 1973 alone. The opera windows became a cultural icon. Every personal luxury coupe suddenly had to have them. Ford made them standard on the Elite. Chrysler added them to the Cordoba. Even Mercedes-Benz offered them on the 450 SLC. But the Monte Carlo had them first and wore them best. They became so associated with the car that people called any small decorative rear window a Monte Carlo window, regardless of what car it was on. The mechanic from Detroit who'd stood in the pits at Daytona bought a new one in 1973. White with a burgundy interior, the new swivel bucket seats that turned 90 degrees to let you exit gracefully. His was one of the last with the 454, even in its neutered state. He kept it for exactly 1 year before selling it, not because anything went wrong, but because the magic was gone. The government regulations had turned it from a performance luxury car into just a luxury car. The difference mattered to people who remembered what it had been. The 1973 model year marked the end of the first generation. Over 600,000 had been sold in 4 years. The car that wasn't supposed to exist had become Chevrolet's most profitable model line. The accountant from Michigan who'd worried about those lost sales was now a vice president. The designer from California had his own studio. The kid from engineering school who'd suggested using the Chevelle platform was running the entire division. Success has many fathers, and the Monte Carlo had proven successful beyond anyone's dreams. The salesman from Boston remembered the last first-generation Monte Carlo he sold. December 1973, a loaded Laguna with every option including the new rear window defroster and space-saver spare tire. The buyer was a widow from Cambridge, 73 years old, paying cash with insurance money from her husband's death. She'd never owned a new car in her life. Walked into the showroom, pointed at the Monte Carlo, and said she wanted that one, the pretty one with the long hood. Didn't test drive it, didn't haggle on price, didn't care about gas mileage. Her husband had always promised her that someday they'd have a beautiful car. Someday had finally come. That story captured what made the Monte Carlo special. It wasn't really about transportation. Nobody needed a hood that long or opera windows or swivel seats. It was about desire, about having something beautiful just because you wanted it. In an era when cars were becoming appliances, regulated and homogenized into boring safety, the Monte Carlo stood for something else. It said you hadn't given up on style. You still believed a car could be more than just a way to get from point A to point B. The second generation arrived for 1974, and everything changed. The engineer from Ohio who'd designed it had been given an impossible task. Make it smaller to meet fuel economy standards, make it cheaper to meet price targets, make it safer to meet government regulations, make it still look like a Monte Carlo. The result was a compromise that satisfied nobody. The wheelbase shrunk by 4 inches, the weight dropped by 200 pounds. The biggest engine was now a 400, and it made less power than the old 350. But the market had changed, too. The oil embargo of 1973 had doubled gas prices overnight. Suddenly, that 12 miles per gallon didn't seem so acceptable. Insurance rates were killing performance car sales. The government was threatening to mandate speed limiters on all cars. The muscle car era was over, and the Monte Carlo had to adapt or die. The 1974 model tried to split the difference, keeping the long hood proportions while shrinking everything else. It looked like a Monte Carlo that had been left in the dryer too long. The racing team stuck with their first-generation cars as long as NASCAR would let them. When forced to switch to the new body style, they found it was actually more aerodynamic despite being smaller. Cale Yarborough won the Daytona 500 in a second-generation Monte Carlo. Benny Parsons took another championship. The racing success helped sales, which hit 148,000 in 1974 despite the oil crisis. The mechanic from Pittsburgh still had his 1970 model. He'd rebuilt the engine at 90,000 miles, replacing the cam with a mild performance grind and adding headers. Nothing crazy, just enough to wake it up. Maybe 290 horsepower instead of 250. The difference was noticeable. The car felt eager now instead of just willing. He'd fixed the cracking vinyl top by having it removed entirely, painting the roof body color. Looked better without it, cleaner. The opera windows stood out more. He drove it to work at the steel mill every day, 30 miles each way through Pennsylvania hills. Winters were rough. The Monte Carlo, with its rear-wheel drive and nose-heavy weight distribution, was terrible in snow. He kept 200 pounds of sandbags in the trunk from December through March. Still got stuck twice that winter of 1974, once in his own driveway. But when spring came and the roads cleared, all was forgiven. That first warm day with the windows down, V8 rumbling, ribbon of asphalt ahead, made winter worth enduring. The third generation came in 1978, and this time they got it right. The designer from Georgia who penned it understood that people still wanted to feel special, even if they couldn't afford the gas for a big block. He made the new Monte Carlo look expensive without being expensive. The hood was still long, though not as long. The opera windows remained, now with optional etching. The grille was more formal, more Cadillac than Chevrolet. It looked like what it was, a car for people who'd made it to middle management and wanted everyone to know it. The engines were pathetic by earlier standards. The biggest available was a 305 cubic inch V8, making 145 horsepower. A 1970 SS with the 454 could have towed the 1978 model backwards and still won a drag race. But gas was heading toward $1 a gallon, and 20 miles per gallon suddenly mattered more than quarter-mile times. The new Monte Carlo delivered, averaging 18 city, 25 highway with the 305. Not exciting, but practical. The accountant from Michigan, now nearing retirement, bought a 1978 in triple black paint, black Landau top, black interior. It was his fifth new car, but his first Monte Carlo. He'd always admired them, but thought they were too flashy for an accountant. Now at 62, he didn't care what anyone thought. The car made him happy every morning when he walked into the garage. That was worth the $423 monthly payment. The NASCAR teams initially hated the third generation's aerodynamics, but they figured it out. By 1983, Monte Carlos were winning everything again. Darrell Waltrip took the championship. The connection between the street cars and race cars was getting tenuous. NASCAR Monte Carlos had nothing under the skin in common with what Chevrolet sold, but the marketing value remained. Every Sunday, millions watched Monte Carlos going 200 miles per hour. Every Monday, thousands walked into Chevrolet dealerships. The SS returned in 1983, though it was more about appearance than performance. The drivetrain was unchanged from regular Monte Carlos, still that wheezy 305, but it had ground effects, sport mirrors, and special wheels. It came in only two colors, white or dark blue, with contrasting stripes. It looked mean, even if it couldn't back up the attitude. They sold over 4,000 the first year, mostly to guys who remembered when SS meant something and hoped it might again. The mechanic from Pittsburgh finally sold his 1970 in 1984. 170,000 miles, third engine, second transmission, countless memories. The buyer was a kid from Ohio, 19 years old, paying $800 he'd saved from a summer job. The mechanic knew the kid would probably destroy it, wrap it around a tree showing off for friends. But he remembered being 19, remembered wanting something cool more than wanting something practical. He handed over the keys and told the kid to respect the car. The kid nodded solemnly, then lit up the tires, leaving the driveway. The mechanic smiled, despite himself. The fourth generation arrived in 1995 after a 7-year hiatus. Chevrolet had killed the Monte Carlo in 1988, focusing on front-wheel drive sedans that made more financial sense. But NASCAR teams kept racing Monte Carlo-bodied cars, even though Chevrolet didn't make them anymore. The demand from racing fans and nostalgia buffs convinced GM to bring it back. The new one was front-wheel drive based on the Lumina sedan. Purists were horrified. Front-wheel drive in a Monte Carlo was like putting training wheels on a Harley-Davidson. But the market had changed completely by 1995. Gas was cheap again, but buyers wanted different things. They wanted cup holders that actually held cups. They wanted airbags and anti-lock brakes. They wanted CD players and keyless entry. The new Monte Carlo delivered all of that, plus decent performance from a 3.4-liter V6, making 215 horsepower. It was faster to 60 than many of the smog-choked V8s from the late 70s. Progress came in different forms. The designer from California who'd created the original had retired to Phoenix. He bought a 1995 Monte Carlo Z34 just to see what they'd done to his baby. After a week, he had to admit it was a better car in every measurable way: faster, safer, more reliable, more comfortable, better built. But it had no soul. It was transportation, not aspiration. The long hood was fake, just empty space over a transverse engine. The opera windows were gone, replaced by a conventional greenhouse. It looked like what it was, a two-door Lumina wearing a Monte Carlo name tag. Sales were decent, but not spectacular. 30,000 in 1995, climbing to 40,000 by 1997. The NASCAR connection helped. Jeff Gordon won championships in Monte Carlo-bodied cars, though they shared nothing with production versions except headlight stickers. Dale Earnhardt made the Monte Carlo intimidating again, even if only on Sunday afternoons. The marketing department played up the racing heritage, conveniently ignoring that the race cars were rear-wheel drive tube frames, while the street cars were front drivers, built in Canada. The fifth generation came in 2000, still front-wheel drive, but trying harder to capture the original spirit. The designer from Japan who penned it studied every Monte Carlo generation, trying to distill what made them special. He brought back the long hood look, even if it was still mostly empty space. He made the greenhouse more formal, more private. He couldn't do opera windows. Modern safety standards made them impossible, but he suggested them with thick C-pillars and a narrow rear window. The SS returned in 2004 with genuine performance this time. A 5.3-liter V8 making 303 horsepower in a front-drive platform designed for half that power. It was absurd, like putting a jet engine in a school bus. Torque steer was violent enough to change lanes without touching the wheel. The front tires lasted about 10,000 miles if you babied them. But it was genuinely quick, 0 to 60 in 6 seconds, quarter mile in 14.5. Numbers